The time that we're going to look at tonight is not humorous. It's not pleasant. It is, in a word, my word, absurd. I'm glad that you all are humorous. Thank you for your humor. Since this is not a positive topic, tonight's lesson, we're going to start with a little bit of my humor. I hope it's acceptable.
I was interrupting by looking it up. As a noun, it means mount, M-O-U-N-T. The easternmost of three prongs of the peninsula of Chalcis in northeastern Greece. But it actually means, Athos actually means mount in Greek.
So it's Mount.
Not
Mount.
So you don't need to say Mount Athos, you can just say Athos. Right? It's like the VIN number on a car. You could say, what's the VIN number? It's the vehicle identification number. So you don't just say, what's the VIN number? You just say, what's the VIN?
That's right.
Same thing. Athos as his mount. Sorry, I digressed.
You ready?
Yes.
Yes.
We'll shut that off. Should have shut it off before church, huh? Okay, here we go. Josef Dumfart war in 1909 geboren,
What?
in Österreich geboren.
Sprechen Sie Deutsch.
Verstehen Sie?
Ja,
I
ich
gotta fix my hearing
verstehe.
aid, just a minute.
Your hearing aid's not going to help you.
Ich verstehe.
He died in 1958, no, I'm sorry, 1985, and is buried in Laurel Hill Cemetery in Omaha.
And his name's actually Dumfart.
Doomfart.
Sorry.
My dad used to call me that.
It is a very interesting name, and I don't mean Joseph. What could be the origin of that name? Germans like to combine words. So perhaps it's a derivation of two German words, doom, which means dumb or stupid,
Stupid gas.
sorry, and fahren, which
Oh.
means
To
to
drive.
travel
Right.
or to journey. Stupid journey. That's the subtitle of tonight's examination. In fact, it's not one stupid journey, but it's 9 Doomfahren,
Knowing doing
Meaning the
otherwise
Crusades.
known as the Crusades.
Okay. Where did you find out about Joseph Doomfart? Did you just make it up?
No,
I mean, how do you find something like
He
that?
looked it up on
Well,
the
the truth
Register
is-
of Names
Huh?
of Cemetery in Omaha.
a couple of years ago, your brother sent me a picture of his gravestone.
Oh, okay.
As a joke.
Oh,
See,
I would skip a generation.
because it couldn't mean what you think it means, because pumpernickel actually
Okay,
means
stop.
fart nozzle.
So, when you talked about, you mentioned Umber, and to recap, his excommunication, I can't even speak after that, his excommunication of the Patriarch of Constantinople, you saw was a defining act in the separation of the Church of the West from the other four patriarchates. But things didn't stop there. In 1059, a Roman synod established that popes would be elected by cardinals. Which kind of foreshadowed the growth of papal authority as it would get stronger and stronger. Europe continued to fragment into independent nations, the Germanic nations, different kings and princes. Feudalism continued to grow, but really began to have a very negative effect on the common people. We enter a period where there was not enough food for people and famine began. We see the appearance of armed bands of goofy guys with metal things all over their bodies, knights they call themselves, and they were going around like killing each other because they didn't have anything else to do. The famine got worse and worse and gave rise to the idea of overpopulation of Europe in some people's minds. And that would be one of the factors that some had for the rationale for starting crusades. Get rid of the people and we'll have more food. While the conflict raged in the West, the Eastern Empire, as we'll see, came under new threats from the Turks and the Arabs. They had had a period of respite or peace. But it really enters a long period of real struggle in the West, between the papacy and royalty, these kings and princes and things. If you don't believe me, I'll give you some examples. Example one occurred between 1075 and 1080, and it was basically Emperor Henry IV versus Gregory II. Gregory VII. Pope Gregory VII. Henry IV appointed a new Archbishop of Milan. Well, he wasn't supposed to do that, particularly not if you're in the church and have the perspective of the church having the authority to do that. So Pope Gregory VII called a synod and excommunicated the king. And then a lay assembly decided, well, if the king can't be rejoined to the church within a year, he has to stop. He can't be the king any longer. He would be deposed as emperor. So, a year later, Gregory VII and Henry IV met in Tuscany. Henry IV appeared barefoot and penitent before Gregory VII for 3 days, and Henry restored him to the church. Gregory restored Henry to the church. 3 years later, Henry deposed Gregory VII and appointed Clement III as Pope. So you can see some of this conflict. This began in 1190. Henry VI sought to begin controlling the church by excommunicating the Pope. But he died, Henry VI did, and Pope Innocent was elected by the cardinals. Philip succeeded Henry as king, but Pope Innocent deposed him and put into the kingship Otto IV. That started a war in Europe that lasted for 10 years over this conflict. Philip was killed, and Innocent excommunicated Otto because he tried to depose the Pope. There are more examples here in the content, but maybe just mentioning one. King John of England, we mentioned a marital experience of 3 marriages. And King John of England had a similar marital issue. He married, but he didn't want her anymore. So he appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury who would support him. And Innocent the Third, who's still the Pope, called for Philip of France to lead a crusade or a war to England because of what John of England did. Interestingly, King John capitulated and called off the crusade. Pope Innocent did. And King John of England signed in something in 1215 a document called the Magna Carta, which you've probably heard of. And among other things, that document limited the power of the English king. So those are just a few examples of the conflict and the struggle for power specifically. At the time of the Magna Carta, Pope Innocent called a Fourth Lateran Council in the West. And in it, he said that local bishops should seek out all heresies and destroy them. Pretty strong words. In the 1000s and the 1100s, and in going into this time, pilgrimages increased significantly. Pilgrimages to the Holy Land, and especially to Jerusalem. They were considered, and the church taught, that the Western Church, that they were the highest act of personal devotion that you could express. They taught that going on a pilgrimage was an imitation of monastic life, and going on your sins would be forgiven if you went on a pilgrimage. So lots of people were doing it. But in 1071, the Seljuk Turks, Muslims, conquered pretty much all of Asia Minor And the Byzantine Empire was almost immediately reduced to half its normal size. Not tonight, but incidentally will go on into the next session. This Byzantine reduction will continue until basically the Byzantine Empire is Constantinople. In 1079, these Turks took Jerusalem, and of course, pilgrimages stopped. Well, that wasn't good. The East, because of this conflict and reduction of their empire, appealed to Pope Gregory VII, but there was no response. The Jews and Christians in the territories that were taken over by these Turks, and particularly in Jerusalem, were allowed to operate as self-regulated units. Also, they were allowed, quote unquote, to pay very heavy taxes. And operating as a self-regulated unit really meant that the clergy were responsible for the behavior of the Christians. To that extent, the clergy, the Christian clergy, Orthodox clergy in the East, were required then to begin wearing the black robes of that were worn by Muslim Islamic judges, because they considered them judges and solely responsible for the behavior of the laity and the black hats. And that, in fact, is why, or the origin of Orthodox clergy, priests wearing black robes today as a reminder of Orthodoxy's subjugation to Islam. This has happened before, but it became routine for the sons of Christians to be forced to accept Islam and to become Janissaries. And I think we mentioned it before, but if you don't remember, Janissaries are Islamic soldiers who are always at the front line. They're the first to be killed. So in 1095, Pope Urban II, at a council of Clermont in France, delivered a very decisive sermon to French nobility. He talked about rampant violence in Europe, about the need to help Greek Christians. He talked in graphic detail about the atrocities that the Muslims were performing on Christians. He spoke of a new kind of war, crusade, and of rewards in heaven for those who might go and die. He urged people to take the cross and recover the Holy Land. And for the next year, 1095 through 1096, the Pope traveled throughout Europe, especially in France and Germany, preaching about crusade. And that served to incite the Europeans. in 1096, then after he was doing all this traveling and preaching, he declared it, quote, "the will of God that the churches of the East and West be restored," unquote. And he appointed a bishop of a French bishop to lead a crusade to take back the Holy Land. Bishop Ademar of, I don't know how you say that in French. At the same time, there was kind of a weird guy in Germany by the name of Peter the Hermit. And initially without the knowledge of the Pope or the bishop, he gathered people, particularly from Germany, and began another group going down, and they joined. Their plan was to take the holy sites and Jerusalem, but they decided to first go to Constantinople. They were welcomed by Emperor Alexis of Constantinople, but within a few days, I would imagine, he found them so unruly that he asked them to leave. And they did. They immediately went to Nicaea and took Nicaea. In 1098, they laid siege to Antioch. They were losing the battle, and an Armenian, Antioch was filled with Muslims and soldiers, Muslim soldiers. And an Armenian Christian sneaked to the main gate, opened up the gate, and the Crusaders rushed in and totally defeated the Muslim army in Antioch and took Antioch. It's recorded that one historian or person who was on that crusade at the taking of Antioch has written, quote, "As for the Turkish women, we did nothing evil to them, but simply speared them through," unquote.
Oh, that's nice.
I mentioned that in 1099, well, I didn't, but in 1099, the Muslims took Jerusalem. I mean, the Christians, Crusaders, took Jerusalem from the Muslims. So they proceeded to Constantinople, then Nicaea, Antioch, and finally to Jerusalem. They took Jerusalem, and basically all defenders, regardless of their ethnicity or faith, whether they were Islamic, Christians, Jews, whatever, were killed. The Crusaders raped the women and children, and babies were thrown from or against walls. Jews were burned in their synagogues. And in 1199, something called the Knights Templar were founded in Jerusalem. Anybody familiar with the Knights Templar? It's within the Masonic Lodge. In 1187, after 1099, the Islamic Sultan of Egypt began attacking Jerusalem, and he retook Jerusalem. And that was the reason for the Second Crusade, which was from 1145, I said 1187, but it's not, it's 1147, 37. And that crusade was called by Pope Eugene III to be led by King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. Their plan was to take back from the Sultan of Egypt the holy sites and Jerusalem. Both Western armies, the French army and the German army, were defeated completely. That precipitated a third crusade, (1189 to 1192), which was called by Pope Gregory VIII. And he specified that it be led by King Philip II of France, Emperor Frederick I, and Richard the Lionhearted of England. Frederick I, you may know as Frederick Barbarossa, was drowned on the way to retake the Holy Lands. Richard the Lionhearted was captured and ransomed to the King of Germany by the Muslims, and that crusade finalized a treaty with the Muslims which allowed them to retain Jerusalem, but to accept pilgrimages. Well, that wasn't good enough.
Better have another crusade. It's getting fun now. We better have another.
So Pope Innocent called for the Fourth Crusade, and they were supposed to go to Jerusalem by sea and to be led by a Count, French, and Cardinal Peter of Puy. It's an interesting crusade, particularly from the Eastern perspective. There were supposed to be 35,000 people. And their plan was to go by sea, first to Egypt, basically conquer the Muslims in Egypt, and then go to Jerusalem and take it. Well, how would they get across the ocean? And the answer is that they went to Venice after having made arrangements with the Venetians to construct the ships to transport 35,000 crusaders to Egypt. You may recall that Venetians were, and had been for a long time, outstanding shipbuilders. Well, only 12,000 crusaders showed up in Venice. And they didn't have anywhere near enough money to pay the Venetians what they owed them for the ships. And for that reason, the Venetians took control and changed the objective to an economic one, to, among other things, recoup their money. And that meant that they decided to go to Constantinople instead, which they did, and they sacked the city. While they were marching to Constantinople, Pope Innocent III heard of their plan and demanded that they not attack the city. But they ignored him. The Crusaders on the Fourth Crusade burned the library, the great library in Constantinople, and burned much of the city and looted it. Well, that wasn't enough. Most people say that there were 8 crusades, but there were actually 9, because in 1212, the powers that be advocated what they call the Children's Crusade. And again, or especially here, one of the reasons for this was overpopulation and famine. It was really composed of people of all ages, but principally children. They gathered in Marseille, France. We don't really know who led it, if anybody led it. We don't know that they even had a plan. 75% of the children died on the way. And most of the remaining ones, this was as they began the crusade, and most of the remaining ones were sold into slavery. Well, continued Muslim domination of the city of Jerusalem precipitated the Fifth Crusade, 1213 to 1221. It was called by Pope Innocent III and his successor, Pope Honorius III. It was led by King Andrew of Hungary and Duke Leopold of Austria. Their plan was, sound familiar, to conquer Egypt and then take Jerusalem. They were defeated in Egypt. So, of course, Pope Honorius called for the Sixth Crusade, 1213 to 1221, to be led by Emperor Frederick II. There was very little fighting. They got there. Again, plan was to conquer Egypt and then take Jerusalem. They got to Egypt. There was very little fighting. But Frederick managed to settle with the Sultan of Egypt, and he was given Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth. He immediately then proclaimed himself king of Jerusalem. And within a year, all those cities were lost because the Muslims retook them. Thus, the Seventh Crusade was called by Pope Innocent IV and Emperor Frederick II, who managed to get back. But I guess he was smart enough to not lead this one, so he appointed King Louis IX of France. Care to guess what the plan is? You got it.
I guess we're going to Jerusalem via somewhere. That doesn't work, we'll go sack Constantinople.
Well, here is what Louis said in a letter before he went to Egypt, to the Sultan of Egypt. Quote, "As you know that I am the ruler of the Christian nation, I do know that you are the ruler of the Mohammedan nation. The people of Andalusia give me money," that's an area that they had taken, "and gifts while we drive them like cattle. We kill their men and we make their women widows. We take the boys and girls as prisoners and we make their houses empty. I have told you enough," to the Sultan, "and I have advised you to the end. So now if you make the strongest oath to me, and if you go to Christian priests and monks, and if you carry candles before my eyes as a sign of obeying the cross, all of these will not persuade me from reaching you and killing you at your dearest spot on earth. If the land will be mine, then it is a gift to me. If the land will be yours and you defeat me, then you will have the upper hand. I have told you and I have warned you about my soldiers who obey me. They can fill open fields and mountains, their number like pebbles. They will be sent to you with swords of destruction." Unquote. He was, when they got to Egypt, promptly captured, held prisoner, and ransomed by the Egyptian army, and the Crusaders were defeated.
So much for strong letters.
Yeah. Well, Louis IX escaped, and he got back to Europe. And what did he do? He called Louis IX, King Louis, not the Pope, called for the Eighth Crusade, 1270. It was led by King Louis IX himself and Prince Edward of England. It was the first crusade that was not called for by a pope. Well, they had a little bit different strategy. They were first going to attack Tunis, and then Egypt, and then Jerusalem. Not too much different. Many of them died of disease in Egypt. It was particularly bad weather there at this time. And before they did any fighting, the crusade was actually abandoned. What are the results of these Moyen Doomfahren? There were no permanent conquests of the Holy Lands. There was no slowing of the spread of Islam. These things all hastened the disintegration of the Eastern Empire. there was a hardening of schism between the Eastern and Western Christianity. Then why not? Remember the Fourth Crusade. It produced greater enmity between Christianity and Islam, of course. And during that time, we saw a pretty significant growth of the authority of the medieval papacy, which reached its apex probably around the time of Pope Innocent III. What was the Eastern perspective of the Crusades? The crowning of an independent emperor, Charlemagne, by the Pope, broke the unity between the East and the West. To have unilaterally changed the Nicene Creed was an insult to the ecumenical councils and to the Holy Spirit. The Western use of unleavened bread in the divine liturgy was an insult to the Holy Spirit because leavening of the bread symbolized his presence. And the sacking of Constantinople was reprehensible. Neun Düsenfahren, nicht wahr? Not so?